Okay, so appeasement part two. This will focus on Munich, and this is generally where we see the connection to the term appeasement. Now, what we see in Munich certainly extended much earlier than just the fall of 1938. British representatives have met with Hitler a handful of times, even as far back as 1937, regarding this area, and appeasement had been established much sooner than just at Munich. Indeed, these meetings led Hitler to rightfully realize he would not be stopped. Czechoslovakia was created after World War I at Versailles with the combination of two main peoples, Czechs and Slovaks. The nation also included a number of German-speaking people who lived in the Sudeten area on the border of Germany. The German-speaking folks wanted to be in Germany. They were not happy about their situation in a Slav-controlled state. And there is great historical antipathy between German peoples and Slavic peoples. And again, the Russian people, or the Russian Empire, or in this case, the Soviet Union, has also historically viewed itself as the leader of a pan-Slavic empire, as the protector of the Slavs. So again, this is further kind of tension between the two. Why would Hitler want Czechoslovakia? Well, a few reasons. First of all, take over their military and their modern military equipment. Mostly German people in this area, at least in the Sudetenland, and he sought to connect all German peoples. We talked a little bit in the first video lecture on appeasement about the need for resources, and there were significant valuable resources in the Sudeten area, lignite, coal, among others. And of course, as with many of Hitler's actions, this was about Lebensraum, or living space for the German people. He needed more living space. In 1937, Hitler was less concerned with domestic policy, more on foreign policy, specifically rearmament of the army, the Luftwaffe. In fall of 37, meeting begins to set plans for war. Hitler to take advantage of the international situation. England and France were both weak militarily. They had fallen back into isolationism after World War I. Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, in a June 1937 speech said, quote, "Nevertheless, the politically fluid world situation, which does not preclude surprising incidents, demands constant preparedness for war on the part of the German armed forces to make possible the military exploitation of political favorable opportunities should they occur. Preparations of the armed forces for a possible war in the mobilization period of 1937 to 38 must be made with this in mind." This would start with a war in the East. Quote, "The war in the East can begin with a surprise German operation against the Czechs in order to parry the imminent attack of a superior enemy coalition. The necessary conditions to justify such an action politically and in the eyes of international law must be created beforehand." According to German officials, Czechoslovakia was to be, quote, "eliminated from the very beginning." Now, what does all this mean? It means that much further back, they were already planning for this. They realized that they must have a quote-unquote legitimate reason to go into the Sudetenland, to take any part of Czechoslovakia. And again, this was the goal, to eliminate Czechoslovakia from the beginning. In a November 5th, 1937 meeting, Hitler would claim, quote, "The aim of German policy was to make secure and to preserve the racial community, the Volksmasse, and to enlarge it. It was therefore a question of space, or Lebensraum." The German racial community comprised over 85 million people, and because of their number and the narrow limits of habitable space in Europe, constituted a tightly packed racial core, such as was not to be met in any other country, and such as implied the right to a greater living space than in the case of other peoples. Germany's future was therefore wholly conditional upon the solving of this need for space, end quote. So again, why the desire to expand? The need for space, the need for self-sufficiency. This was one of Hitler's goals. Food, industry, etc. England and France are weak. The goal here, and what Hitler believed, is that he would solve his need for space, or Lebensraum, by 1943 through 1945. He would take advantage of the European situation in Spain, Italy, and Ethiopia, as well as the domestic issues concerning these nations. Now, concern among his underlings. They knew of what he wanted, but not as aggressive as before. One problem, the ambassador to Germany, Sir Neville Henderson, grew increasingly chummy with the Nazis, including Goering and Himmler. He would go on hunting parties with them, for example. One diplomat noted, quote, "Henderson leaned too much toward the Nazis. We also have no British unity. Eden and Chamberlain, those critical of Hitler, those who viewed positives regarding a relationship with him, they're kind of all over the map. Chamberlain, again, is kind of the great appeaser. Again, he believed give Hitler what he wants, and we'll get out of there. Churchill, of course, took a stronger line. He is not prime minister yet. Foreign Secretary, the Earl of Halifax, would meet with Hitler and further appease him, assuring Hitler the British had no desire to drive a wedge between Berlin and Rome, and that a four-power meeting might be the best chance for peace. In the meeting, Halifax assured Hitler, quote, nobody wished to treat Germany as anything but a great power. Hitler would dominate this meeting as he would others, and he put the British and Halifax in their place. He was to call the shots. Halifax, after this meeting with Hitler, quote, although there was much in the Nazi system that offended British opinion, I was not blind to what he had done for Germany and to the achievement from his point of view of keeping communism out of his country as he would feel of blocking its passage west. The specter of anti-communism yet again. Now, a few things to look at in this. Again, he's justifying his lack of action by saying, well, he's achieved some good things in Germany, even though he's offended our opinion. Now, the full account or the full impact of his treatment of what he called the useless eaters was not yet completely evident, but there is some sense. Obviously, the Nuremberg laws provide one such example. German leadership played a bit of good cop, bad cop with Halifax as well. After Hitler shut him down, he would meet with Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels, I had expected to dislike him intensely, but I'm ashamed to say that I did not. That is what Halifax said about Goebbels. Upon his return to London to visit the cabinet, Halifax concluded thusly, quote, everywhere he encountered friendliness and a desire for peace. Goering had assured him, apparently with Hitler's approval, that, quote, he could see no circumstances in which the two countries would fight, and that, quote, not one drop of German blood would be spilt in Europe unless it was forced on them. A big eye roll here. Upon hearing all of the particulars, Chamberlain concluded the German visit was, from my point of view, a great success because it achieved its object, that of creating an atmosphere in which it was possible to discuss with Germany the practical questions involved in a European settlement. I wanted Halifax to convince Hitler of our sincerity and to ascertain what objectives he had in mind, but Hitler and Goering said repeatedly and emphatically that they had no desire or intention of making war, and I think we may take this as correct at any rate for the present. Whoa, talk about naive. On the German side, Hitler recognized the sincerity of Halifax, but, quote, had instead deduced weakness. He now knew that Britain would happily entertain the prospect of possible changes to the existing order and would almost certainly not go to war to prevent expansion of the Reich. Halifax's biographer would say, quote, Halifax let Hitler see his chance. And indeed, Hitler recognizes all the things that have happened. We discussed some of these in the first lecture. We discussed some of them here. Hitler realizes Britain is not going to stand in his way. France is not going to stand in his way. March of 1938, Hitler assures Prague he will not target it. By May, this will begin to change. In Czechoslovakia, again, there are 3 million Germans in industrial areas along the Sudeten Mountains. We have propaganda. The Czechs were supposedly persecuting Sudeten Germans. The Prague government would protest. They would offer home rule to the German minority. Germany concentrates its massive forces on the border, and the Czechoslovakians do the same. Chamberlain was unwilling to publicly criticize Hitler. He believed Nazism sprung from Versailles, and if Hitler's legitimate grievances were satisfied, Germany would return to the League and discard the worst parts of Nazism. Again, how does Chamberlain have a gig at this point? September 13th, 1938, Chamberlain telegraphs Hitler asking to meet him in person. 2 days later, there is a conference between Chamberlain and Hitler. Chamberlain accepted Hitler's demand that the Sudeten Germans be accorded the right of national self-determination. Thus, the Reich would acquire all the Sudeten areas along the frontier, the population of which was more than 50% German. President Beneš of Czechoslovakia bowed to this proposal, fearful that the West would abandon him. Hey, Beneš, they already did. This also led Poland and Hungary to issue similar demands regarding their population in Czechoslovakia. So this led to kind of a domino effect. But Hitler wanted more. He wanted to dismantle the entire Czechoslovakian nation. When Chamberlain returned for another meeting on September 22nd to discuss the details for transferring the regions, Hitler made new demands. He wanted neither plebiscites nor negotiations. He insisted rather on immediate and unconditional surrender of the undisputed regions by October 1st. This, he declared, was his last word. Chamberlain returns to London September 23rd to fears of a near future confrontation. The French and the British governments reject these demands as unacceptable. The Royal Navy is placed on alert, and the French reluctantly begin to mobilize their forces. Hitler, 2 days later, gives a speech in Berlin repeating his demands. He further states, quote, "This is my last territorial claim in Europe, but it is a claim from which I will not recede. I declare my patience is at an end." Some German diplomats and generals plead with France and Britain to stand firm, that Hitler did not have the people's support and that an overthrow was still possible. Erich Cord, a secret messenger sent by potential conspirators, was not granted a hearing by Chamberlain, though. Churchill would meet with him, but again, he is not in power, so he can do very little. September 26th, Chamberlain gives a speech to the British people. How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Now, the faraway country part of this quote is somewhat ridiculous. That's a faraway country to the United States. England, France, they're very close. Chamberlain had also been in touch with Mussolini to urge him to moderate Hitler's demands. Mussolini knew that Italy was not prepared and already had its own hands full in the Spanish Civil War, as well as in their invasion of Ethiopia. Mussolini, Chamberlain, and Premier Daladier of France, as well as FDR, also pled to Hitler to postpone his invasion. He finally agreed to an international conference of four powers, Germany, Italy, Britain, and France, to meet in Munich on September 29th. The West did whatever was necessary to stop the invasion. This meeting, they blackmailed the Czechoslovakians. The British minister in Prague warned President Beneš that if the Czechs rejected the new plan, they would be responsible for the war and their own destruction. Face plant. The French minister informed Beneš that should Czech stubbornness lead to conflict, the French would not fulfill their treaty obligations. The four powers gathered at the Brown House, considered the Nazi general headquarters. Who isn't there? Why is this important? The Czechoslovakians, for obvious reasons they should be there, and the Soviets are not there. Now, the Soviets, again, have guaranteed to defend the Czechs in case of an invasion by a European nation, but remember that caveat, they would only do so if the French had already entered the fray as well. The powers here would agree to Hitler's previous demands. The Czechs were given from October 1st through the 10th to complete their evacuation of the Sudeten areas that were inhabited by more than 50% German. Also, they would see the famous Anglo-German agreement that the two nations promised to never declare war on each other. Let me repeat that. The famous Anglo-German agreement in this conference that the two nations, England and Germany, would never declare war on each other. But the British and French, of course, did guarantee the free frontiers of the now mutilated Czechoslovakia against future aggression. Well, thank goodness for that. Yugoslavia and Romania waver in their loyalty to the Western powers after this. Hungary would tighten its association with Nazi Germany. Consider the ramifications of the post-war world. If the West shows up and truly supports these Eastern European nations, do they slide so easily to the Soviet Union during the Cold War? So what if history is questionable? It's something to consider. Of course, who is the one voice that speaks out against Hitler, who says this is not a good idea? Winston Churchill. Munich Agreements finalized September 30th, 1938. The aftermath, Chamberlain returns to England, thinking he's a hero, declaring, "We have peace with honor, we have peace in our time." Notably, he is carrying an umbrella, and after this time, the umbrella is always associated with appeasement, with surrender, with weakness in general. He is also quoted as stating that Hitler's were, quote, reasonable demands. Appeasement is even made the official policy on October 31st, 1938. Chamberlain himself said to the British cabinet, quote, "Our foreign policy is one of appeasement. We must aim at establishing relations with the dictator powers, which will lead to a settlement in Europe." Which makes no sense. If your foreign policy is appeasement, then you really have no foreign policy except rolling over and letting other nations do what they want. Unfortunately, the way he couches this leads to elation in Britain. British people are thrilled. Hey, we don't have to go to war. We don't have to go to war with Hitler. We can avoid another world war. Now, what does Hitler think? He's angry. He wanted to demonstrate his power and the power of the Prussian military machine. He did not want this to be settled by peaceful negotiation. He wanted to invade. Quote, "This has been my first international conference, and I can assure you this will not be the last." It's my favorite part of the quote coming up. "If ever that silly old man comes interfering here again with his umbrella, I'll kick him downstairs and jump on his stomach in front of photographers." This did not get large industrial arms producing areas and the mineral wealth of the rest of Czechoslovakia. This also upset Hitler. And this, of course, would be just part of his goal. He had taken Austria. He now takes part of Czechoslovakia. Next, he will expand into Poland, into the areas that were taken from Germany that he felt were rightly theirs after World War I. And of course, we'll see him go into the Ukraine and Russia itself to gain this living space eventually. And Germany would roll into Czechoslovakia. Hitler still is not happy. He bullies his way. He threatens Czech leaders that if they do not comply with the Munich Agreement, they will be crushed. First, he gives them 24 hours, then he gives them only 8. March 1939, plans are made to roll over the rest of the land, but President Emil Haka is taken to Berlin, threatened with total devastation if he did not agree to become a protectorate of Germany. He capitulates as he would rather his own country not be destroyed. Hitler is elated. Quote, "I will go down as the greatest German in history." Czechoslovakia ceases to exist. Britain and France knew what he was doing, but they wanted to use Germany again to help prevent the spread of communism. They wanted to prevent war. And so rather than possibly challenge Hitler, rather than possibly lose that buffer between them and the Soviet Union, they roll over. Some politicians in France and Britain believed Hitler's actions were justifiable due to the harsh peace of Versailles. So here you see an example of weakness on the West, which very much facilitates Hitler's rise to power and the war itself. Part of this is about him taking the Sudetenland, but more importantly, it shows what the West will do or not do in the face of German aggression. The next lecture will be on the early invasion of France, and I'll start that off with a little bit on Poland because that is truly where the war officially begins.